Hello, ladies. Welcome to Homemaking Radio. I hope you get a few things done while you listen today, which is what these videos are intended for. And if you would, please click subscribe and ring the bell on the channel so that you'll be notified when both my channel has been updated and my blog, because I'm making these videos for my blog and they will be on there. And to go there, by clicking the link in the description box, you can go to the page on which I have embedded this so that you can see the rest of the story and a description of what I have spoken about. And so to begin with, as a homemaker, remember that you're going to be working probably as your own boss and in isolation, and this can be quite daunting or even terrifying if you're used to having your life laid out for you and you've gotten on a train and you're going to stop when it stops, and life is just leading you along, and you don't have any personal responsibility except to do whatever the employer says or whatever the teachers say, and someone else is educating you at home. You're going to be autodidactic, and you're going to train yourself and teach yourself and learn on your own. And this is almost a lost art among people because we've been taken away from the home from the time we're very small and gone, quote, somewhere else. Everybody goes somewhere else. Do you remember that old movie called Please Don't Eat the Daisies? I don't remember anything about it except that the man was kind of a hypochondriac and thought he was dying because he had listened to somebody else's diagnosis at a doctor's office. But the opening scene, I believe, was a neighborhood and all the cars backing out at a certain time in the morning and all the women coming out of the house to put the trash out at the same time down this street. And everyone was organized and regulated by something else that was going on. But in the home and real homemaking, and especially if you're homeschooling, we can't do that because people aren't machines, and you're not a machine either. And so that's why I say when you begin your day, go into the bathroom for a while, take a bath or a shower, whatever you like, and take care of yourself. And sometimes we get a little concerned because our children are looking in the mirror a lot and then combing their hair. Even the boys are looking at themselves. They're just, it's not a problem with vanity, in my opinion. It's just they're just getting to know themselves and seeing how they're changing. And they will look in their eyes to see what kind of personality they have. And it's just, we have to look in the mirror so that we know how we appear to other people. And I often see children talking to themselves in the mirror because it helps them understand what other people see when they talk to them. And so that's why I say go and spend some time in the bathroom, take care of your appearance, take care of your hair, out of respect for yourself and out of appreciation for what God has given you. He's given us our bodies and our voices and our eyes and our smile, and let's go and show some kind of gratitude for that by taking care of ourselves. And one of the problems of the 1950s homemakers, housewives, was that there was being kind of an undermining effort against homemakers by showing them as being lazy, sloppy, unkempt, fat, unable to take care of themselves, unintelligent, which wasn't true, but it made a lot of young women not want to be wives, mothers, and homemakers. And of course they bought the narrative, and whenever somebody said, oh, well, she was just a housewife, and that word just a housewife was very demeaning and intended to be demeaning. Because if you grew up in the 1950s, you probably had a mother who was home who just worked all the time. Now, I grew up on a homestead in Alaska, and those women up there were more than half responsible for providing a warm, safe home for their families and for their husbands, and food for their husbands. And even though our dads always had jobs in the oil fields or on the highways or in lumber or My father had a cat. It was a John Deere tractor, a small John Deere tractor that cleared land. He cleared land with it, and so that was his independent side jobs. But he also always tried to find other jobs. And his first job was at Elmendorf Air Force Base. And he also learned to build airplanes. And one time he and a friend of his, and they called them a buddy of his from the military, built an airplane in the man's living room. And the wife came home and from being, quote, outside. We used to call it outside when they went to the South 48 to visit their parents, or the women just went for the winter because the winters were so harsh. And come back and find an airplane being built in their living room. And I remember the woman was quite upset about that. And my father built a boat in the living room too. But the women were amazing, and my mother was a homemaker. Most of them were. Hardly ever find a woman in that era that was actually working unless it was absolutely necessary. And I remember someone coming over one time on the homestead and asking, people just used to come by. If you could see them on the highway driving past, they would never drive past. They would always come by. It was considered very rude to drive past and not come in. So they come down the little road and into the house, and my mother always offered coffee and pie. And she would say, we'll have to sit in the kitchen because my husband is building a boat in the living room. And in the wintertime, you'd build what you could inside and get ready to finish the rest in the summer. It was just an interesting life. But going back to my original subject of the homemakers of the 1950s, they weren't like they were stereotyped to be. And so, but then we went to public school when we were younger, and there was already an agenda to turn people away from marrying someone who just wanted to be a housewife or being, quote, just a housewife. And so you never said you wanted to be just a housewife. You wanted to say, you'd say you wanted to be something else. And so what I want you to start out with, to avoid some of these stereotypes that people give the homemaker as being some people who just don't care, is to get up no matter what your age is and get yourself a bath or a shower, and then go and have a look at your hair and dress as beautifully as you can. I'm just going through my closet and realizing that one of the greatest things about being a homemaker is I can pick out what I want and wear it at home. And no matter if it's not in style or if it's maybe something that is beautiful, but it's just been hanging there waiting for someplace to go. I realized a long time ago that I was never going to get invited to someplace formal enough to wear some of the things. And so I just decided to go ahead and wear them. And some of these clothes were from years ago when I did have to have something fancy to wear somewhere. And we've had a couple of years where everyone was kind of homebound, and there wasn't anything open to go to, and there was a lot of people ordering and everything. But the beauty of being at home is you can dress up as though you were going somewhere important, and it gives you, I believe, now everybody's different, a feeling of having something very, very important to do. And you don't really need the feeling to know it, because it's definitely there. I can't seem to get my house settled down. I'd like to join the Fly Lady prompts, how they send you things and help you get your house back in order. But I had to get my house in order so that I could at least start following some of this stuff, because it was just too much of an emergency. Now, in making a list, and see, that'd be the second thing you would do. I have preparation includes, and I just call it prep, includes your appearance. It includes your prayer. It includes your exercises. Now, there's one lady I've been going to on YouTube, and her name is Natasha Mohin, I think. I think she's probably from India. She does 1 minute stretches, 1 minute exercise, and so does Fabulous 50 sometimes. But I like to find out what those 1 minute exercises. She concentrates on belly fat, which is what many of us are saddled with, and so I can spare a minute for an exercise. I often cannot get to the computer and think of even doing a 20-minute exercises or 10-minute exercises. It's just too much. So I do a 1 minute exercise, and then I'm always careful when I'm in the home and doing some homemaking to just stretch a little bit further when I'm making the bed, to reach down to the floor to pick something up, and kind of like when you're touching your toes and reaching up to get things, and being more aware of using my body and my muscles so that I can last a little bit longer and come here and talk to you, even though I'm vital. And we all know, those of us who've been a while, we don't say elderly anymore. We say vital because all our vitals are working if we're breathing and our heart is beating. And so now the next thing after the preparation, and I say that involves your appearance, it involves your prayer, it involves a quick exercise, and it involves making a list. Now, why make a list? And everyone complains, I make a list and I get probably none of it done, but I get a whole lot of other things done. And I have friends that say that they always make a list of what they have done rather than what they want to do, so that they can see that they really do get a lot accomplished. But I make a list and of anything I can think of that is just from the most urgent to the least urgent, and things I would like to do. And it's just as they come to my head, I'll make a list. But then I will categorize them in the order that I want them done, and I'll put a little number on them, and circle them like this is number 1 down here. This is more important than this, and I'll just put them in the order in which I'd like to do them. These lists also, if you sit down and make a list, there's something quite settling about it. When I was cleaning up my mother's things, I noticed a lot of lists that she had, and I didn't think at the time how important those lists were, because they indicated that she was trying to think, and she was trying to focus, and that she was aware of her responsibilities and aware of how necessary these things were. And so, some of the things we look for when we go into antique stores, or we find old papers and diaries of people, and we go buy an old cookbook and somebody has a list in it or a recipe, is we look for how they were thinking. And this is just evidence of the past. There should be a whole lot more of it that we could find, people's old lists. And last time I was speaking to you, I talked a lot about flowers, I think, or was that the time before, and the importance of fresh flowers. And I would say, if you're taking notes, I would say essentials for homemaking would be fresh flowers. And you can, get a very inexpensive bouquet and divide it up and put it into tiny little jars and vases all over the house, so you have them everywhere. They're a bright spot for you. And the other thing would be something that you like to drink in the morning. I like my tea, and it's got to be Yorkshire Gold. But I have been doing a lot of stealth sipping, where I have a sip of something else. That I've got all these different kinds of teas, and I normally don't like them, but because I prefer Yorkshire Gold. I'm quite addicted to it. But I want to try them all out and be fair to all of them. But I don't want anybody to know that I'm just drinking tea all the time. So I stealth sip, and I'll go and take a picture of it. And I got it from stealth camping, because nobody will let me go stealth camping now that I'm so vital to their happiness. They don't want me to risk anything. So I will go stealth sipping and find a place on the manse, in the manse, around the manse, outside, inside, and stand there or sit there or be there and just do my little sip. And I take a little picture for you and for my descendants. These videos are actually for my descendants, because even though they probably are too young to listen to them now, one day they might want to know, how did we live? Now, I brought my Bible here, but I can't quite remember what it was we were reading in ladies' Bible class. If you have something you need to do, you can go do it and listen while you work indoors or outdoors. And I'm trying to think where we were. There's another lady that comes, and she keeps track of where we are so she can correct me because my mind is so scattered. But it was here it was in 2 Peter verse 11. Since all these things are thus to be dissolved, what sort of people ought you to be in lives of holiness and godliness? And so we talked about how people are just concerned about the end times. They're always talking about, oh, is this the end? Oh, is this a sign of the end and everything? But that was saying, and they sifted it through, and they were reading it over and over and discovering meanings in it. And one of them was, okay, since these things are going to be all dissolved, it was talking about the earth and the end, and it said, but since it's going to be over, how should you live? And it said with godliness and let me see, what was the other word? It says, what sort of people ought you to be? Yes, since all these things are thus to be dissolved, what sort of people ought you to be in lives of holiness and godliness? Isn't that interesting? So that should be our focus. You can't solve anything. Your house won't get cleaned up thinking about the end times, talking about it all the time. That's not what's important. What's important is, since all these things are thus to be dissolved, what sort of people ought you to be in lives of holiness and godliness? And this is so important because that's not going to help you get your house cleaned up. Listening to the news is not going to help you get your house cleaned up. Listening to religious people talk about the end times is not going to give you character. We've talked a lot about character. It's not going to increase your holiness or your godliness. Holiness means just being set apart, being apart, from the stuff that goes on in the world. And so I just thought that was so significant that some of those ladies had just by reading it over and over discovered the people that hold up the sign, the end is near. You remember the cartoon guy that held up the sign saying the end is near? They should be instead saying, what sort of people ought we to be in lives of holiness and godliness? So as homemakers, what sort of people are we going to be? Are we going to follow the stereotype that people have of homemakers as being sloppy, lazy, never making any effort in their lives, never accomplishing anything? And what I mean by accomplishing things is, besides being homemakers and housekeepers and teachers of children and guiding and guarding children and their minds and homeschooling them and learning about health and proper food and that sort of thing, you can accomplish something. You can leave behind your lists, your little books that you write for your children, letters to write to each other. When my children were growing up and we were homeschooling, we wrote letters to each other in the house, and they had places to put them. I think sometimes we just would glue together a couple pieces of paper and make an envelope for the door of their room, and then they would put letters in each other's places. We would check our mail. And so these kind of things are treasures. These are precious. They're not commercial, and they're one of a kind. You can do so many things. You can accomplish something. You can have something that you do that is worth keeping during this time. It says, what sort of people ought we to be? And think about that. What do you want to be? I'm just getting ready to try to get on track with my homemaking and everything. And I have certain goals. I don't want my children to have to come here when I get sick or unable to care for myself, to have to go through stuff that just puts more of a burden on them while they're still raising their own family. But I talked about a minute ago about the essentials of homemaking that I have chosen, and one of them was flowers, fresh flowers. And the other thing that I really think is important is, if you can, sew your own clothes, because then you get a better choice. But if you don't sew, your clothing at home is really important. It has an effect on how you feel about what you've got to do. And I can remember years ago when we used to move a lot, everything was in such a jumble. We'd get the beds out at least, and then we'd spend the night, and we'd get up the next morning, and I'd look at it. It was just awful. But I'd get in the bathroom, get my shower, get all fixed up, and put an apron on over my clothes, and just, fix some breakfast, and just kind of try to be as normal as possible, and then little by little work on that mess, just a little, and not try to be overwhelmed. And the other thing, besides the flowers and your own personal clothing that cheers you up, I believe, is choosing the kind of drink that you like. Because that, have you ever had to go on a trip or something, and you weren't used to the environment or something, and you really missed your morning tea or your morning coffee or something that you liked, and it just kind of puts you off or unsettles you. And so these things are really, really important. And then the other thing, of course, is if you can get a subscription to Victorian magazine or Tea Time magazine. These are beautiful publications that don't have any bad news in it. They don't have any agenda. They're just beautiful, and they just stir the heart, and they're all about refinement and goodness and beauty and loveliness. They should be called Philippians 4:8. There's very rarely any. Now, they're not perfect. They're not the Bible, and they're not. They weren't written by the apostles, but they are absolutely beautiful, and I always liked having them in my home. And before we had a curriculum for homeschool, sometimes I would use the old Victorian magazines from the 1980s and 90s, because they had a lot of history in them, and they also had visits to foreign countries that you couldn't go, so you could just do armchair travel. And they had gardening, beautiful menus, table setting, indoor, scenes of different rooms in the house, and just give you inspiring ideas and help you love life at home. To me, that's an essential, to have the Victorian magazine in your home. And because I had read about flowers before, and I mentioned that Mrs. Andolin's husband had written a book for men, and I remembered that he had particularly written about flowers. So he wrote this little section called Why Flowers. Many men are at a loss to know why women so appreciate flowers. Now, I wasn't always that way. I grew up where we had flowers in the garden, and my mother didn't like us to pick them or bring them in. Sometimes she would go get the lilies on the lake. She would row her little boat over there and pick some lilies and bring them in and put them in a little bowl of water on the table. But she didn't like us to go around picking the sweet williams or the pansies or all the things that grew up there, because we needed that color in the yard, and so she didn't want us to bring those in. And we should all have a cutting garden and then just your general landscape, which you don't cut. Although when my descendants come, I let them go ahead and pick stuff out of there, because it's going to fade away anyway by the end of the summer. And so he says, many men are at a loss to know why women so appreciate flowers. A short time ago, a young man asked me to suggest something he could send his mother for her birthday. Flowers, I said. Women are always enjoying receiving flowers. But they are so perishable, said the young man. See, that was my problem, is that going to bring me flowers, and they're just going to, all the petals are going to fall off, and they're just going to fade away. But listen to what he says about this. They are so perishable, said the young man. That's why they are such a meaningful gift, I replied. If a man is willing to spend his money on them, it's a token of love. Yeah, but at the grocery store, they're not particularly expensive. He had never thought of it this way. I uncovered the mystery about flowers from the Polynesians. While in their islands, I watched a lady making leis. She explained that it was often necessary for the woman to stay up all night to make beautiful leis for early morning ships coming to port. That's a lot. Now, do you remember back in the olden days, probably the early 60s or even late 50s, when if we would go to Hawaii, when we got off the plane or the ship, there were Hawaiian people standing there with leis that they put on around the necks of every single visitor. I don't think they still do that, but it was amazing. That culture seems to be gone. There's a lot of trouble to go to when they only last a day or so, I said. That's the beauty of it all, she replied, because they are so perishable, they convey only the true meaning of love. This concept of flowers makes them appropriate to show attentiveness. It is clear demonstration that a man is perceptible to the thoughts of a woman. A gift of great worth is perhaps a greater method of proving real love, since it indicates greater sacrifice. But these gifts are given only rarely. They are not the type to show attentiveness. Flowers are fragrant, beautiful, inexpensive, and therefore fitting to carry the message, I am thinking of you. And also, I think that one of the other books I was reading was saying that flowers represented the beauty and the fragileness and the delicacy and the sweetness that we want for women, that we expect of them. We expect them to be. And that's why I've been reading so much to you about refinement and femininity, because women are supposed to be different than men, and so their rough, brusque ways would be opposite of what a woman did. Now, I want to read to you about a garden bouquet, so that if you have to have your own, we don't have to spend money at the grocery store, but around here it's so inexpensive. And sometimes those flowers at the grocery store do not work out. They almost die immediately. I don't know how they keep them alive in the store. You get them home and it doesn't work the same way. Even if you use the little preservative packet that they give you, sometimes they get stuck and they don't open up or bloom. But here's from your garden. Picking and working with flowers from your garden can be a pleasurable and satisfying experience. And this is from the book called A Bouquet of Flowers. The jacket is gone, so it's hard for me to see. Cut flower says satisfying experience. Here are some tips for the gentle care and cut of flowers. Cut flowers early in the morning, if possible, when the scent is the strongest. When cutting flowers, especially in very hot weather, soak them for an hour or so in deep, cool water, then arrange them in a vase. Have you ever worked with a florist or watched what a florist did? And I've often suggested to young women who want to be something or do something, why don't they go into flowers or for things that comfort people like this? Cut flowers the day before they are required. Always use a sharp knife or florist shears when cutting stems. I prefer the kitchen shears. Cut stems at an angle to increase the area through which the plant takes in water. Hard-wooded flowers like lilacs should have their stems crushed with a hammer before putting them in water. Remove excess leaves from all flowers. Flowers can suffer from overhandling and temperature changes, so replace the water only when necessary to prevent a stagnant odor. So that is my little spiel on flowers. Now, another thing that I think that is really essential to homemaking is to get lovely cookbooks that inspire you. And I like the tea books, and I have one here, Tea with Jane Austen, and it's amazing. You know, I've got my old favorite, the one I've had since I was married. And but sometimes it's fun and really stimulating to get a book that has different pictures in it of food and just ideas of, you know, that's just a little bit more energizing to read it and try it. So I tried one of the recipes in here, and it was called Tea with Jane Austen by Kim Wilson. and I was just sitting down. I thought, I'm just going to read this a little bit more. And I tried one of the recipes, and it was called Modern Bath Cakes. And it was a very interesting bread, and it's just buns that are just beautiful, and the taste was slightly different. And then I tried plum cake for an elegant breakfast, and it had a lot of grated fruit zest in it, and chopped dried fruit, and it was just interesting. And sometimes now I don't like to get up and eat breakfast, and I'll wait for hours before I eat anything, sometimes till afternoon, and then I just want so in the morning sometimes I just want a little tiny bite of something. I would like to have this ideal breakfast cookie that had just enough, not too sweet, but just enough stuff to drink with my tea to make me feel like I had a treat. And so I tried this, and I made the plum cake for elegant breakfast. There were no plums in it, and I told you before I'd read about this why it was called the plum cake, because the plum just meant fruit. And what she did in here was she took the old recipes, the original recipes, and she defined them, because sometimes they didn't have exact measurements, or sometimes they had different words, and she just corrected it all and made it easy for us to make. So I want to read a letter by Jane Austen, and it's called A Grand Breakfast with the Austens in Stoneleigh Abbey. Breakfast at the Austens' home itself consisted mostly of tea and toast, but Jane had many opportunities to experience the grander sort of breakfast commonly served at the great houses. And I want to just stop a little bit and explain why so many of us like Jane Austen, and everybody seems to have a different reason. And for me, being a young person growing up in the wilderness, to read about somebody like this to me, she lived a grand life. It was different. It was different than what we lived. And someone who was more refined, who wrote stories, who drank tea, was something out of the ordinary for us, because our life was harsh and hard, and not full of, not so much luxury, although we did enjoy ourselves. We did enjoy life. So this was just a different glimpse into a different kind of life for me. And one of the reasons that I like it is that she lived the kind of life that every young girl would have liked to have lived, to have something brought to you on a tray, and to have a sister that you would write to. And so let me just finish reading this. Breakfast at the Austens' home itself consisted mostly of tea and toast. Now realize the toast probably was more home-baked, homemade, which is a lot different than your commercial bread and the taste. And I did read to you out of Brian Kozlowski's book, the Jane Austen Diet, on bread, and how bad it was when they started adding things in the Regency era. He claimed that our modern bread got its idea from the Regency era, because when they got back from a trip, the Austens would sometimes complain about having a stomach ache from bad bread, because the commercial bread, they would put things in it, fillers in it to make it puffy, and things that really weren't good for you, and they're still doing that. So I suggest, if you can, make your own. If you don't do well with yeast bread, just make a baking powder biscuit, or some kind of it's called quick bread. It doesn't have yeast in it. And your cookbook should have a section called quick breads. And all those are just like a little, it's just like mixing up a cake. And they're just not as sweet. And so you could manage that. But Jane had many opportunities to experience the grander sort of breakfast commonly served at the great houses. Now, I'm not sure what the great houses would be, but probably a step up in wealth from what her family was. She often visited her brother Edward and his family, at the estate that he had acquired when some childless cousins adopted him as their heir. And when Mrs. Austen's cousin inherited a large manor house at Warwickshire, he invited her. Cassandra and Jane went to visit. Mr. Austen wrote to her daughter-in-law in raptures over the beauty and size of the house. And I think one reason for me for kind of identifying with her, although we probably differed in some religious views, was that her father was a minister of sorts, and so he was dependent on wherever he lived to have a place provided for him, kind of like the manse here where I live. So Mrs. Austen says, 26 bed chambers in the new part of the house, and a great many, some of them very good, in the old, and the vast surrounding estate. Like Mrs. Jennings in Sense and Sensibility, she seemed particularly impressed by the food. So I'm not sure if this was written by Jane or by her mother, but it's written from Stoneleigh Abbey, August 13, 1806. My dear Mary, here we all found ourselves on Tuesday, that is yesterday, eating fish, venison, and all manner of good things, at a late hour, in a large parlor hung round with family pictures. Everything is very grand and very fine and very large. The house is larger than I could have supposed. I expected to find everything about the place very fine and all that, but I had no idea of its being so beautiful. At 9 in the morning we meet and say our prayers in a handsome chapel that follows breakfast, consisting of chocolate, coffee, and tea, plum cake, pound cake, hot rolls, cold rolls, bread and butter, and dry toast for me. That must have been Jane who wrote this. The house steward, a fine, large, respectable-looking man, orders all these matters. I do not fail to spend some time every day in the kitchen garden. You know, the kitchen garden used to be the one, especially on the homestead, was the window by the sink. When you're washing dishes, you could look out the kitchen garden, and there was a little garden there. We could see how the salad supplies were growing. Where the quantities of small fruits exceed anything you can form in an idea. This large family, with the assistance of a great many blackbirds and thrushes, cannot prevent its rotting on the trees. The garden contains 5 acres and a half. The ponds supply excellent fish, the park excellent venison. There is also great plenty of pigeons, rabbits, and all sorts of poultry, and delightful dairy, where is made good butter and cheese and cream. It's not difficult to recreate the breakfast Jane, Cassandra, and their mother ate at Stoneleigh Abbey. Gather your prettiest china, good tea and coffee, and hot chocolate if you like, and a nice assortment of cakes, rolls, and bread. Don't forget butter of the best quality. An elegant morning gown is optional. And that's another fun thing you can do when you're raising children, is you can go and maybe replicate something in the past or from a different country that you might eat and try out. And kids aren't always enthusiastic about something different. Some children just want everything the same, and they don't like to try new things. Others are a little more adventurous, and but you can use your same food, and you can have elegance. If you live alone, you can still do that. You can get dressed up in the morning. You can set a fine table. You can choose the night before something, get it ready, something that you want to try out, maybe from one of these old reprinted cookbooks like the Jane Austen cookbook or anything else, from Tea Time magazine to anything you find, and just do things a little different and make life a little bit different. And I wanted to read a little bit more to you from Linda Lichter's Simple Social Graces, where she had been a reporter and was asked to do a story on how much better American women were now in her time in the 20th century than they were back in the Victorian times. Those awful Victorian times where women were so oppressed and repressed and depressed. And so as she began to research it, she would find their letters, and she would find diaries, and she would find magazines, newspapers, books that were written, reports of any kind, and also memories, pictures, paintings, sewing, crochet, any kind of needlework and tapestry, and just any kind of their furniture, their games they played in the home, like the board games, their social life, their recipes, even the funerals, the things that were said at funerals, what the churches were like, what the sermons were like at churches, what religious people did, and how the women dressed and cared for the clothing. And she just went into great length. As you can see, it's quite a big book here, but it turned out to be very interesting. And it was from this book that I showed you the difference of women at the beach, because we had been to the beach and for our 50th wedding anniversary, and she had shown the difference of men and women having a holiday on a summer's day at Coney Island, and how respectably they were dressed, and compared it to today. And so she was really good about bringing out the photographs and things like that. And I had been reading to you out of here about the home and what they thought of the home. And there were several quotes I read to you last time. For instance, a physician named William Alcott called the home his blessed retreat from the turmoil of business. Reinvigorated by this nightly respite, he could return the next day to the business that paid his family's bills. And it was talking about the workings of the Victorian home and how everybody contributed and was expected to help make that home functional, and also do some of the physical improvements of the house, and that home and house were interchangeable. So, and it's all the things that the women had to know about. They had to know about, I'll just reread this because I read this to you last time, but I'll just reread it because I'm going to go a little bit further today. Women were expected to serve as the family doctor and pharmacist. And, they knew about herbs and medicinal qualities of plants that were kind of hidden from us back in the 1950s, because I don't remember very much except what my mother knew already. And everything was taken care of in my day by the medicine cabinet and the aspirin and stuff like that. But there was, before this, women knew a lot more about how to treat health. And it says that preserving domestic health required a working knowledge of ventilation, heat, lighting apparatus. I remember they wanted us in the old days to make us go outside often. And so often, sometimes uncomfortable, and we didn't want to, but they thought it was important for our health. And she had to know about lighting and waste disposal and potential lethal things in the home, infectious diseases, etc. As if her plate weren't full enough, she was the household accountant, the seamstress who made clothing, drapes, and linens, and the carpenter who crafted pictures and mirrors. And she had to pull all this together to what Catherine Beecher, I believe, wrote a book on the home, on homemaking and food, called A Beautiful Effect by the Wise Disposition of Color and Skill in Arrangement. Martha Stewart, she said, eat your heart out. Above all, women were the paragons of that defining Victorian virtue, thrift. Frugality was highly respected as a feminine accomplishment, and a wife's ability to budget, bargain, and keep her financial house in order, determined by her family's fate as much as her husband's paycheck. So how she preserved and conserved their finances was as important as his paycheck. So it was almost like they doubled it. And one thing that you could do that will help is not to have so much money going out. We always say at the grocery store, "Oh, ma'am, you saved so much because of these sales." Well, of course, there's no I don't have any savings in my hand. But what they mean is you didn't have that much going out. You prevented so much going out of your bank account. And one thing that we can do, and let me just give you a real simple example of not having to spend money. We were talking about the paper napkins during our ladies' tea last week when they came, and they don't often use them. They're still sitting there unused beside their plate. And what they had discovered many years ago when they had to thrift for their growing families was if they taught their children to eat neatly, there was no need for a napkin. And even then, it was in the days when you had to wash a cloth napkin over. And oftentimes their cloth napkins sat beside their plate for several meals before they were gathered up and washed because they didn't use them. And what they did was they taught the family to eat in a very neat way so that it wouldn't require any wiping of the mouth, any wiping of the face or the fingers. They just were taught to eat very neatly, and then they wouldn't have to wipe their hands on their clothes or on the napkin. And so if you get in a pinch, a financial pinch, and you want to stay home and you don't want to have to go out, and remember this, a lot of women have said, especially in Helen Andelin's books, the more thrifty you are, the more you protect your role at home. Because if you start spending money and you start getting in debt and you want things that would require you to go get a job to pay for, that's when you're putting your homemaking life and your job as homemaker at risk. So even though this seems like a little tiny thing, it's very interesting to think of it, to save on your paper towels and your napkins by just being more neat and tidy in the kitchen or at the table. And so if we eat well and we are careful how we eat, and you can often take or find courses online on how to eat, how to eat in a polite way so people aren't disgusted when they're eating with you, and how to chew with your mouth closed, and all that normal stuff. How to just go from babyhood to adulthood and maturity in your eating. You actually don't need a napkin too much because you become very aware of the mess you're making. You're not children anymore, and you don't have to create a mess. And so that's just something to consider. And I have thought about that too, because I use a lot of paper towels just in cleanup in the kitchen. And I've thought, if I cooked more carefully, if I mixed my scones up more carefully, I wouldn't be, splashing stuff around. And I do have a dish rag, but sometimes I use paper towels for other things. And so these ladies were talking about how to be more careful and precise and neat in what you did so that you'd save on the cleanup and you wouldn't have to use a lot of these paper products. Now, of course, in the olden days, we didn't have them, but we had what's called dish towels and dish rags that we used. But still, those would start to wear down or smell bad, and you'd have to wash them. And my mother used to boil the tea towels, the kitchen towels. And they were not terry towels like they are today. They were just plain cotton. And to clean them, you had to boil them. And I think it was probably some kind of detergent that she had in there with them. And because now, have you noticed that sometimes a tea towel will start to kind of not have that freshness even after you've washed them? Well, they did different things with them. And I think they may have had books that they read about these things in, and some of the women's magazines told about them. So today's thoroughly, let's see. So I was talking about how frugality was highly respected. And it says here, the Ladies' Home Journal editor even advocated teaching young girls this skill not only through maternal example, their chief means of all domestic education, but by giving them charge of their father's business ledger. That's the same as we used to do. Children get to be teenagers and you would go to the store with them and give them the money and a list and help them shop for themselves to see how much money they would have left over and to do their best. Any Victorian homemaker worthy of the name did not buy now and pay later. She took to heart the widely read advice and edifying example of Dickens' immortal wastrel Wilkins Micawber, who failed to practice what he preached to David Copperfield. Annual income £20, annual expenditure 19, result happiness. Annual income £20, annual expenditure £20, ought and 6, result misery. Now, also a lot of people don't like Charles Dickens, and there are several authors that they call classics that I don't like, and I don't like him very much, but I do use his characters a lot, and